Testing is over, and the next time we see the cars on the track will be for FP1 of the Bahrain Grand Prix. 6 different driver and team combinations top the timesheets over 6 days of running in Barcelona and Bahrain. If you're someone who's listened to my 2022 predictions episode, you'll remember that I couldn't pick a champion at that time. Well, the time has come to put a name on the table. Welcome to the 5 Red Lights F1 podcast. My name is Aaron Harper. In this episode, I'll be giving my full constructor standings and my top 5 for the Drivers' World Championship in 2022. I'll also be dipping into some of the news that has broken over the weekend, including Kevin Magnussen's return to Haas. Now, this podcast can be found on Spreaker, Spotify, Google, Apple, iHeart Radio, Castbox, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, JioSaavn, and on YouTube. On YouTube, you can find lots of other F1 videos such as the Flying Lap, where I review all the action and the headlines quicker than the fastest lap time. Or at least I try to anyway. I'm not always successful with that. Like, follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast. Rate the podcast on Spotify on Apple with your feedback on how to improve, or leave a comment on the YouTube video. You can also follow me on social media at 5_red_lights on Twitter and 5redlights on Instagram. You can take a look at my blog, which can be found at 5redlights.wixsite.com/5RL podblog, featuring my F1 articles as well as every podcast and video that I create. Okay, let's get going with my Constructors' Championship order. So I'm going to go bottom to top in this, and I'm going to start in 10th place with Alfa Romeo. I'm not convinced that they've brought out a great car, and I think the unluckiness of Bottas is bound to strike at some point, and I'm not convinced Guan Yu Zhou is really Formula 1 material. So they're down to 10th place. Now, I have had to rewrite this after the Bahrain test because what I'd originally written then looked a bit wrong. But unfortunately, Alfa Romeo, they did drop down actually, if I remember correctly, because Haas in 9th place have jumped up a place. And that's mostly because they've signed Kevin Magnussen now. So I think they're going to have someone who's going to contend a little bit more strongly for points and is just a better all-round F1 benchmark for that team, and they'll know exactly what they need to do with that car because they know what Kevin's like. And also it's a good barometer for Mick Schumacher. In 8th place I've got Alpine. Again, not convinced they've quite nailed this regulation change, and if they haven't, we know what Fernando's like. He'll start throwing his toys out the pram, so it could be a tricky season for Alpine, and Ocon blows really hot and cold. He did win a race last year, and it was put on a plate for him. Of course, he did have to go and execute that race, but he struggled last year. So I think it's going to be a tough season for the Enstone team. In 7th place, I've got Williams continuing their trajectory of upwardness. Last year they finished 8th, and I'm going to tip them to go to 7th this season. And I did suggest that they could finish ahead of Aston Martin, but I don't really think they will in the end. I think Aston Martin will finish in 6th. They'll have just enough to cover off the Williams pair of Latifi and Albon, but it's going to be close between those two because both have had a few issues in testing, but also not looked slow, but also not looked quick, really. They've kind of been there or thereabouts, while other teams, the bigger teams, have been doing like longer runs and stuff. So it's not completely certain that where those two are really for me. But I do think that AlphaTauri are slightly ahead because they looked pretty well set through Barcelona and Bahrain testing. So I've got them in 5th place. Obviously, that does hinge on how Pierre Gasly leads the team and if he's pushing really for another seat elsewhere, and what sort of Yuki Tsunoda we get too, because he really let the team down in terms of scoring regular points last season. If he can up his game to a more consistent level and pick up, like a 4th place like he did in the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, then AlphaTauri could realistically aim for that 5th place. They could even finish higher if one of the top 4 teams trips over themselves early on. But for AlphaTauri, they've got to... What they didn't do last year is bag the points early on when they had really good opportunities to. If you think about Gasly knocking off his front wing in the opening race in Bahrain, and then the bizarre decision to put Gasly on full wets at Imola, and then not to pit as well. He just cascaded down the order. So AlphaTauri operationally let themselves down. They need to get Yuki Tsunoda at a good level scoring points, but they do have an ace in their pack in Pierre Gasly. So we reached the top 4, and it's the same 4 teams that pretty much everybody's putting in there, let's be honest. But my order could be, well, you could call it slightly interesting. In 4th place, I've got McLaren. I think they're going to be quick. I think they're going to win a race or 2, and it's going to be interesting to see how they get on top of this brake problem that they've got. If they can get on top of it, it looks like they've got a fast car, but at the moment it looks fast but fragile. In 3rd place, and I know this team looked very, very quick in testing, especially which was yesterday, actually, because this is being recorded the day after the final day of testing. In 3rd place, I've got Red Bull. I think Max is going to be, again, on fire. He's going to be pumped up to deliver with the number 1 on his car. Now, the problem for me lies in Sergio Perez. How well does he perform? And if it's a really close fight with the Ferrari team and the Mercedes team and McLaren as well, I actually think Red Bull have the 4th best driver combination there. I'm not really sure who they can put next to Max, who would do a better job than Checo, considering the team dynamic and the way it's sort of weighted towards Verstappen. But I think Sainz and Leclerc is a stronger lineup, and I think Russell and Hamilton is a stronger lineup. Norris and Ricciardo certainly as well is a more harmonious lineup, I would think, in terms of developing that car and pushing it forward. So I've got Red Bull in 3rd. That's not to say that they're going to have a poor season in terms of their actual performance. I just think they're going to lose out with Perez not being in the fight enough. And I think they're going to lose out to Ferrari in 2nd place. Charles and Carlos are brilliant. They are an excellent combination. The car, the SF75, looks good. It's running reliably. It seems to be getting chins wagging in the paddock, so that's always a good sign. But these two haven't really been in a sustained title fight, and the pressure's on Ferrari. And we saw in 2017 and 2018, when the pressure was on, the team buckled a little bit. So there's question marks about how they handle pressure as well. But one team that we know will handle the pressure really well, and I think they will deliver again, is Mercedes. I've got Mercedes top of the Constructors' Championship. They're the favourites. And look, don't listen to what they're saying about we aren't ready to win yet. Mercedes are always ready to win, because unless they've produced an absolute mess of a car, then they're going to be in the hunt. They know how to get on top of that car. They've had to do it a few times. In 2017 and 2018, Ferrari were strong and Mercedes still managed to come out on top. Last year as well, their pre-season was a mess, and yet they still won the Constructors' Championship, beating Red Bull. And that was with Bottas bowling everybody out in Hungary and all sorts going on. So don't believe a word that Mercedes are saying about tempering expectations for them. They'll be in the hunt, and I think they're the favourites. I think they will come out on top. But that is just for the teams. That is a 2-driver operation. That comes to the team as well, the mechanics and the strategy guys and the men and women back at the factory, how efficiently they can develop these cars, because there's going to be a massive amount of growth. So this order could be, it could be completely wrong, and who cares? It's predictions. We're all going out on a limb here. And talking of going out on a limb, let's get into the nitty-gritty with the drivers. So for me, there are 7 drivers that I think can sensibly have a claim of trying to win the World Championship this season. And I'll touch on why I don't think there's 8. I think that's fairly obvious who it is and the reasons why, to be honest. So the person I don't think from the top 4 teams that can be world champion, or doesn't really have a sensible, realistic shot at being world champion, is Sergio Perez. And this is nothing to do with that I don't think he's a fast driver or that he's capable of being a world champion. I just think he's in the wrong car to be in with a shot of being world champion. He's alongside Max Verstappen, and we know exactly how weighted that team is towards the Dutchman. So I don't think Checo will even get a sniff of the World Championship unless he pulls out the most miraculous string of victories at some point in the season and all the other drivers seem to run into each other. But, you know, anything is possible in Formula 1, and, you know, it can happen. So there are 3 drivers I've got as outsiders for the World Championship, and they are Lando Norris, George Russell and Daniel Ricciardo. So we'll start with the McLaren boys because I think they are probably the biggest outsiders. They're both certainly fast enough to be world champion in 2022. For Daniel, it would be quite a turnaround from 2021 if he was to challenge for the World Championship, given his struggles with the MCL 35M in 2021. And remember back to 2018 when he was in his final season at Red Bull, he did have an outside shot at the title that year. And he took 2 wins from the opening 6 races at China and in Monaco. And the Monaco one, I mean, obviously it's very tricky to overtake around Monaco, but he was missing 160 brake horsepower for much of the race. But following that win in Monaco, he suffered multiple reliability problems. The team sort of shifted itself around Max, and the packages of Mercedes and Ferrari kind of moved the battle away from the Aussie and from Red Bull, to be honest. And Ricciardo in a title fight would be a fascinating dynamic for me because he's normally such a happy, smiley character, very aggressive on the track, not afraid to go for an overtake. And I'd love to see how the pressure of a title fight really affected Daniel's behaviour and the way he approached things. Would he be able to continue with this light and, you know, really enjoyable persona? Or would we see him tighten up and, you know, would we see a different side to Daniel? That would be really interesting because Daniel is a really likeable guy and a lot of people have a lot of time for Daniel, but he's always coming in as the underdog and he would still be the underdog in this situation. But it would be so interesting to see just how he deals with it. Of the drivers that I've classified as an outsider, he is the only one who is a race winner. 8 times a race winner, of course, so he knows how to get the job done. So put him in that situation where he can win races, and I think Daniel is a legitimate shout for stringing off wins and becoming a world champion. And obviously he got that win last year in Italy where, despite his problems, he got the win in the bag. As for his teammate, Lando is yet to win a race, but he's absolutely ready to win. The championship challenge is a tougher prospect though, and one I think that Lando isn't quite totally prepared for. Now the final piece of that jigsaw for me is winning that first race, and it's an important distinction to make with this, that Lando's win needs to be Lando winning the race rather than just simply inheriting it. So if you think about the way the Sochi race got away from him, Lewis kind of inherited that win because had it stayed dry, I don't think Lewis was getting past. I think Lando had that all under control. And then, of course, the weather got in the way for him. And his team made... he and his team sort of cost themselves with their decision-making. And that is a 2-part dynamic. The driver and the engineer and the team need to have the right information to make the right calls at the right time. And that's where teams like Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton have been so effective over the years. And think back to Hockenheim 2018, Mercedes, okay, Lewis was starting way back in 14th, they had to play the long game, but he had the right tyres on at the right time. So that is critical to being a world champion. And of course Daniel, as an 8-time Grand Prix winner, holds an advantage in that sense, so he can kind of guide the team to what he needs to achieve that race win, and Lando just needs to build that little bit of experience. Now McLaren could have aced the new regs, and the car looks great. Visually it looks fantastic. I love the colour scheme. But for now, what is holding them back is the wait for their new wind tunnel and state-of-the-art simulator to come online. Zach Brown believes they're going to go from strength to strength, and if 2022 sees them move closer to the top 2 or 3, they have the drivers to put themselves into the mix. Now, talking of going into the mix, George Russell, he might be in the Mercedes now, but that doesn't actually make him an automatic choice to become world champion. And he's even said himself that it's not something I'm thinking about. And he said that after the pre-season shakedown in Barcelona. Not a test, but definitely was a test in Barcelona. Now, obviously, the main obstacle in George's path is his teammate, Lewis Hamilton. Hamilton is still fast and still ferocious as he ever was. And George is a sensible guy, but he is an absolute competitor. Russell is going to be under no illusions about how big a task he faces to even get on level terms with Lewis before even surpassing the 7-time world champion within that team. Of course, that might just be a natural sort of transition over the next year or two, because obviously Lewis is at the other end of his Formula 1 career, but we've seen drivers like Michael Schumacher raced into who was well into his 40s. Okay, yeah, he'd had a couple of years out, but still he was doing it in his 40s, and you know, Lewis is at the top of his game. There's nothing to suggest that he's lost any speed or any motivation. So, you know, while he's still got that, George is going to have a real fight on his hands to take that Mercedes team onto his side and build it around him. Now, I do think George will win with Mercedes in 2022, but Lewis, of course, is the leading man, and that is the big problem for George Russell at the moment. As much as Mercedes do give their drivers equal treatment, we saw with Lewis and Valtteri that it's just so difficult to get on top of Lewis through a season. Nico Rosberg did it in 2016. He needed a little bit of fortune to go his way, and he had to sacrifice so much. And Jenson Button beat Lewis Hamilton in 2011 when they were McLaren teammates. But Lewis had all this stuff going on in the background, and Jenson hit an absolute purple patch. So to beat Lewis, you really need everything to align. And Max found that last year. You have to have a great car. Your team has to do almost a perfect job, and you need a little bit of fortune to go your way to get ahead of Lewis Hamilton. And Lewis is going to be totally fired up, considering how cruelly he lost the 2021 championship. Mercedes, though, like McLaren did in 2007 with Lewis, have total faith in George's ability. So it's not out of the question that a driver running at the front in a front team for the first time can compete for the World Championship, much like Lewis did with McLaren. Let's move on to the dark horses, and this was kind of a happy accident because it's the 2 Ferrari drivers, and of course the prancing horse on the Ferrari badge is obviously a black horse. So it's the dark horses, and Ferrari are expected to be the team that close up the most or even join Mercedes and Red Bull at the front of the field. And if their testing performances are anything to go by, that's probably the case. But both drivers have certainly been trying to keep a lid on expectations. That's difficult to accomplish, though, with the adoring Tifosi demanding that a red car is fighting at the front. Obviously, Charles is already a Grand Prix winner, and he has the pace to deliver, but he can be prone to the odd, costly error, the good old I am stupid moments. And I've already spoken about how this is an important season for the Monegasque driver. So if you want to hear more about that, check out one of my previous episodes, the drivers on the F1 hot seat, who 2022 is a big season for. And Charles is now midway through the longest contract Ferrari have ever handed a driver, meaning a title push would actually be quite timely, because he needs to show that he is the driver and he is improving, and that they should continue to hang their hat on him. Now, Charles has predicted that a title could be achieved with consistency and maybe as few as 5 victories. And to do that, he would actually need to reignite his rivalry with Max Verstappen to take those victories. Of course, the pair banged wheels as the Dutchman forced his way to victory in 2019 in Austria, before a sensational fight at Silverstone the following race. We'd also actually get to see a proper opportunity to see how Charles races Lewis Hamilton on a regular basis. We've seen them go wheel to wheel in Monza in 2019, and he held off Lewis in Spa as well, the race before that. But we haven't really seen that since. a proper battle for a position or for the win. And how Charles puts together a season with the expectation of winning the World Championship would be very, very interesting. It'd be a really good barometer of his development as well over the last 2 years. Remember, 2019, he kind of had an outside chance of the title, even though Mercedes were always going to win that. They'd put enough wins on the clock by that point. But he wasn't expected to win the World Championship. The pressure was all on Seb, and Charles could just go in there and be very free and just express himself. But that can disappear very quickly when you start to feel the pinch of pressure and the expectation of becoming a world champion. Obviously, Carlos Sainz, the other driver in the Ferrari, will consider himself a contender for the title now. I've got that, calling him the other driver in the Ferrari is very, very harsh. I don't mean anything by that at all. I think Carlos is a fantastic driver. Now, at the launch of the Ferrari, Carlos stated that the target is to be back up there and fighting for wins and then see what comes next. And I think the Spaniard gives a little bit away to his teammate Leclerc on a Saturday in qualifying, but on a Sunday, Carlos comes to the front and is arguably the most consistent driver in race trim. If you are a Grid Talk podcast listener, you might have heard Tom Horrocks from the Monkey Seat podcast describe Carlos Sainz as Sunday Sainz, and I absolutely go along with that. He finished every race of 2021, and that was regardless of where he started, because his starting positions were quite varied. And in a potentially multi-driver contest for the championship, that could be extremely advantageous. That level of consistency and always finishing. Obviously, where you finish is then important, but if Lewis and Max decide to start crashing into each other again, and Carlos is always hanging around in third and fourth when they do it, that third or fourth becomes a first or second every so often. So just making sure you finish is important. And remember, to finish first you have to finish. Now, both drivers at the Scuderia are fully aware of the challenge that is in front of them, trying to beat Mercedes and Red Bull. And Ferrari obviously are trying to manage expectations on all fronts, because they haven't been in a proper title fight for a few years, and it's easy to get carried away, especially with the romance of Ferrari. Remember, Ferrari haven't won a championship of any description in Formula 1 since 2008. And they haven't had a driver's crown since the year before in 2007 with Kimi Raikkonen, who's now retired. So that tells you just where the Ferrari competitiveness has been. It's been very up and down, and they've had a few issues. It's going to take a massive effort for Ferrari to topple both Mercedes and Red Bull, but the drivers are definitely capable of delivering it. And it'd be fascinating to see how they handle it. And the inter-team dynamic, which at the moment is quite good, how that fares and which way the team decide to go if one of them looks more likely than the other. And all of that leaves two drivers who I have described as the favourites, because you can't choose just one favourite at the moment, because Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen are just so equally matched. They served up possibly the greatest season in F1 history in 2021. They're, again, the favourites. You can't dispute that. And as much as one might try to play the other down or hype themselves up, it's nip and tuck between them. Lewis is the most successful Grand Prix driver of all time, but Max is the reigning and defending world champion, and that means a lot. I had a super chat with Tom Downey and George Howson about the Mercedes and Red Bull's chances in 2022, so go and check that out for a little bit more opinion on those two and their teams as well, and their teammates. As I said, it's really difficult to separate Lewis and Max. They're both irrepressibly quick over a single lap, and they're able to clock off a race at just metronomically rapid speed. It's incredible. And so often in 2021, they simply drove away from everybody else. They left even their teammates 20, 30, 40 seconds behind them. It was just incredible, and it became almost a showdown every other weekend. It was just mind-blowing. Now, I think another year of just Lewis versus Max is fairly unlikely, with the strong suspicion of Ferrari being involved, and also the role that George Russell will want to play, and how he plays that role is going to be really, really important, because if he's battling Lewis, that's going to give Max and the Ferraris a bit of an advantage. And of course, Mercedes will want Russell to challenge and push Lewis, and Lewis will want to be pushed. But Russell will want to be in there at the same time, putting his own point across to be world champion. And let's not forget the two McLaren boys either. But there may come a point where George needs to play second fiddle and back Lewis up to make sure that, Mercedes clinch the two titles. Still I Rise is emblazoned on the back of Lewis's helmet. And the big question is, will he? Will he rise again? He declared at the end, ahead of testing, if you thought the end to last season was my best, wait until you see this year. And that tells us exactly how motivated Lewis is to recapture his status as world champion. And in effect then breaking the record that he shares with Michael Schumacher in the process. Christian Horner has described the fact that Verstappen is running the number one on his car, that it has energised the Red Bull team, and I think the Dutchman himself won't need any energising, as his approach is fast and aggressive. If there are more drivers in the fight, Max might need to be a little bit more circumspect about how he picks and chooses his battles a little bit more, as his aggression, you could argue, almost cost him the World Championship last season. So there's so many different dynamics at play. Does Max need to temper his aggression? Will Lewis rise again? What is George going to be able to do in the Mercedes alongside Lewis? Have Ferrari delivered? And how will Charles and Carlos deal with that? Are they good enough to be in the fight? I think they are. And then what about the McLaren boys? Have McLaren produced a car good enough of putting their two drivers in play? And what if Kevin Magnussen's lap time on day 5 of testing was not a glory run? What if Haas are in there as well? Then we're all wrong. Then we know nothing. So now it's the time to put I'm not sure if money where my mouth is the right thing, but I described it earlier as putting a name on the table. Now, I'm going to give you my top 5 drivers. So in 5th place, I'm going with Charles Leclerc. I think he's definitely going to take some pole positions, and he's going to certainly grab a couple of wins. Maybe not the 5 that he was suggesting is enough to win the championship. But I just think there might be a few errors in there. Maybe a little bit more development needed in terms of being in a title fight for Charles. In 4th place, I've got George Russell. And again, he's going to take a win or two, but I think he's just going to have to concede to Lewis at some point to support Lewis's run, because it's almost a given that he's going to be in there. In 3rd place, I've got Max Verstappen. I don't see Max retaining the World Championship. As fast as the Red Bull looks at the moment, obviously there's a 23 race calendar. We're still waiting for the replacement of the race that was cancelled in the country. We won't mention at the moment. It's going to be tricky. I think Max is going to really need to keep on top of his aggression. He's going to have to think big picture. Maybe being a world champion will have helped him settle down that side of his game. But if he allows himself to get wrapped up in those wheel banging accidents, it's going to cost him. Now in 2nd place is someone who's not been in a title fight yet, and I think he will be very, very close to being world champion, but he'll miss out this season, and that is Carlos Sainz. I think he's just superb. I think he's got so much maturity, and what's going to play really well in his favour is that he's got his dad to lean on. And of course, Carlos Sainz Sr. wasn't a Formula 1 driver, but he is a World Rally champion, and a lot of the core attributes for any champion are, they're cross disciplines. They can be cross translated. So, they're transferable. That's the word I'm looking for. So, I think Carlos can always lean on his dad's experience, and that can give him some sort of support and security as to how to approach certain situations, because Carlos Sr. will have had to face against many very good rally drivers in his time. But my world champion for 2022 is Lewis Hamilton. I think he's going to break the record, and I think if he breaks the record, he might retire. I think he'll go out on a high. He'll do a Nico Rosberg. Whether that happens or not is a completely different prediction, but I just think he's going to be so motivated to put right what happened in Abu Dhabi, and everybody needs to watch out. And regardless of whether the Mercedes is on the pace from the word go in Bahrain, it's a long season. And remember, Red Bull strung 5 wins together in 2021, and they still didn't get the job done ahead of the final race because Lewis went on an absolute tear towards the end of the season. Make no mistake, Lewis is the top dog in Formula 1 at the moment in terms of just all-round ability and being able to play percentages, nail a qualifying lap, nail a race, make an overtake that matters, deal with the media, deal with the pressure. And it's going to take, it takes some stopping him. I just can't see anyone stopping him this season. Now, of course, I'd love to know what your top 5 looks like, so get in touch on the socials, which I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, or just simply leave a comment on the YouTube version of this episode. Let's debate the top 5s, and it'd be really interesting to see if there are any different drivers to what I think are in the championship hunt. Okay, so let's round off the episode with a little bit of news, and the big news is that Kevin Magnussen is back in Formula 1. Last Wednesday evening, Haas announced that Kevin Magnussen would return to the team in place of the sacked Nikita Mazepin. Now, K-Mag returns on a multi-year deal, having already spent 4 seasons with the US team before leaving at the end of 2020. Haas team boss Gunther Steiner said it was a straightforward decision to bring Magnussen back on board, as the Banbury-based team looked for a driver who could add value, not to mention a wealth of F1 experience. And of course, Kevin ticks those boxes. He's been in and around F1 for many years, almost a decade now. So he had his breakthrough year with McLaren in 2014. Spent a year on the sidelines in 2015 before returning with Renault in 2016 and then joining Haas. In his year away from F1, last year in 2021, Kevin drove IMSA sports cars in the US. He subbed in for Felix Rosenqvist at the Road America IndyCar event, as well as competing in the Le Mans 24-hour race with Peugeot alongside his father Jan. And Kevin said, "I was really surprised but equally very excited to return. I was looking in a different direction for my 2022 commitments, but the opportunity to return to F1 was simply too appealing." And the Dane, 29 years old now, he later added, "I didn't know how much I missed F1 that much." And I included the fact that he's 29 because I actually thought he was older than that. He seems to have been around a long time, but he's only 29, which is the same age I am, which means he's still got a lot left to give. He's not yet reached his pomp, he's not in his prime, but he is now a much more rounded individual. And of course, he topped the times on Friday in testing, as Haas were allowed to catch up on the track time they missed due to their freight arriving later than everybody else's. Magnussen's experiences in the last year will have made him more adaptable, and any knowledge that he's gained from those other series, working with different engineers and different ways of setting things up, could actually prove really, really handy in finding solutions to the problems that 2022 cars are having. And of course, having K-Mag on board, who is a known quantity to the team. A lot of the team personnel will obviously have worked with him from his previous stint there, and that can only benefit the team. Kevin spoke of his lost motivation at the end of 2020, and perhaps the dynamic between himself and teammate then Romain Grosjean played into that. They banged wheels on more than one occasion. This time, however, he's the undoubted team leader, and that will prove a very useful yardstick for Mick Schumacher. Now, I don't think Kevin is a race-winning calibre driver, but he does have a podium to his name from his debut in Melbourne in 2014, and he's absolutely a strong midfield competitor. He could snipe a podium if the opportunity is there and if the Haas is good enough. Remember his race in 2020 in Hungary when it rained early, and he made the switch to the... I think he went to the Inters. Or did he go to the slicks? I can't remember. But he pitted before the lights went out, and it paid dividends. It brought Haas a point or two on that occasion. And if you can wring some points out of the VF22, then Mick Schumacher really needs to be doing the same, or a little bit more, to prove that he is, or may be capable of progressing to Ferrari levels in the future. Now, in his first stint in Formula 1, I found Magnussen a little bit too spiky at times. I remember the comment he made to Nico Hülkenberg in the paddock in Budapest. I just thought there was a little bit too much of that sort of persona around him. There was an aura that just didn't quite get on with. But now with a little bit of maturity, the Dane comes across as much more approachable and a more rounded personality, which is really important, I think. And he'll feel more confident in himself being the team leader. He doesn't feel like he needs to get one over on anybody. I'm excited for him, and for Mick, and for Haas. And instead of the team being somewhat akin to relegation fodder in football, the team, I think, now has the equivalent of a ruthless striker ready to punish errors from the bigger teams. And in that sense, I think that Kevin can certainly pick up some points finishes in 2022, because the Haas actually looks much more competitive than it did in 2021 or 2020 for that matter as well. We've reached the checkered flag on another episode of the 5 Red Lights F1 podcast. Now remember to like, subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you find it, and to check out my blog site. All the links you'll need are in the description or the info wherever you find it. The next episode will be a review of the Bahrain Grand Prix. We're going racing again, everybody. It's actually 7 days away at the time of recording. Literally next Sunday will be the race, so we'll be preparing for that. I'm so looking forward to this season. There's going to be so much going on. Literally anything could happen. Thanks for joining me for this episode, and I'll see you when the 5 red lights go out.